3 days after my 65th birthday, the one no one showed up for. The doorbell rang just after sunrise. I wasn't expecting anyone. But there he was, a man I'd never seen before, pale and trembling, standing on my porch like he'd been carrying a secret for years. "Are you Jason's mother?" he asked, barely above a whisper. When I nodded, he swallowed hard and said, "I need to talk to you. It's about Nina." And that's when the floor of my world began to shift. But maybe I should start at the beginning. My name is Elaine Norwood. I'm 65 years old, a retired bookkeeper from a small town in Ohio, widow of 22 years, mother of one grown son, Jason. And until recently, I thought I understood the shape of my family. I thought I knew where I stood in their lives. But what happened on my 65th birthday, and what followed after, showed me just how far from the truth I'd been living. When I turned 65, I thought I would be surrounded by family, my Dashin. I imagined my home filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, the smell of roast chicken and rosemary potatoes in the air. I imagined my grandson Zach showing off another magic trick and Lily tugging on my sleeve asking for more cake. I imagined Jason, my only son, walking through the door with that tired smile of his and saying, "Hey Mom, looks great," while Nina rolled her eyes in that way she does when she pretends to be annoyed but secretly loves everything I cook. Instead, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes a house feel like a waiting room for a life that never showed up. I'd spent 3 full weeks preparing for this day. I picked out the menu myself. Slow-roasted chicken garlic mashed potatoes, those green beans sautéed in butter and almonds that Jason loved as a boy. I special ordered a chocolate hazelnut cake from that little bakery on Maple Street, the one Nina once raved about. I bought fresh peonies and tulips, arranged them in the crystal vase I'd saved from our wedding. And I wrote out each place card in my best cursive. Jason, Nina, Zach, Lily, my sister Sandra, even Carol, my college roommate, who now lived 2 hours away. I left one seat at the end of the table for me at the head where I could see everyone's face. I even bought a new dress, deep sapphire blue. My late husband Robert once told me that color made my eyes look like the sky right before dusk. I wore the pearl earrings he gave me on our 20th anniversary. I curled my hair, touched up my lipstick. I looked in the mirror and whispered, "Happy birthday, Elaine." The table was set for 8. Candles flickered in their holders. The house smelled like warmth and cinnamon and effort. By 6:10, I started watching the clock. 6:20. I straightened the napkins. 6:30. I refreshed the salad bowl just in case. By 6:45, I was making excuses in my head. Maybe there's traffic. Maybe someone forgot the time. Maybe Jason had to make a stop. Nina always runs late. Maybe she needed to redo her makeup. I checked my phone again. Nothing. I went back to the oven, turned the temperature down to warm. At 7:15, I sent a group text. "Just a friendly nudge. Dinner's hot and ready. Hope everything's okay." At 7:45, my phone buzzed. Finally, my heart leapt before I even saw the name. "Jason? Hey, Mom. Sorry we're away this week. Nina surprised us with a family cruise. Happy birthday, though." I stared at those words like they were in a different language. A family cruise. A surprise. I blinked and opened Facebook. And there it was right at the top of my feed, a picture of Nina, radiant in a flowy white sundress, holding a glass of champagne, standing next to Jason, who was grinning ear to ear with Zach on his shoulders, and Lily tugging at his leg. The ocean stretched behind them, perfect and blue. The caption, "Family means everything." So grateful for this time together. Photo after photo, I scrolled through them. Zach building a sandcastle, Nina holding a tropical drink with a flower in it, Jason laughing beside a massive dessert tray. One photo showed all of them gathered at a dinner table, raising glasses in a toast. Nina had tagged everyone. Except me. And suddenly it was like all the air left the room. I looked around. The candles had burned halfway down. The chicken was dry by now. The cake, untouched, sat on the counter like a guest that never got to smile. The chairs were still perfectly arranged, the napkins still folded. I stood in the middle of the dining room in my sapphire dress and pearl earrings, hands trembling, and felt the weight of it all settle on my chest. They hadn't just forgotten, they had planned something else. And they didn't even try to hide it. No phone call. No, "We're so sorry," just a text. And a caption about family. Family? I wrapped the cake in plastic wrap and slid it into the fridge. Turned off the oven. Took off my earrings and set them back in the velvet box. The smell of food that once felt comforting now hung heavy like a cruel reminder. As I turned off the lights in the dining room, I caught my reflection in the window. I didn't look like someone celebrating a milestone birthday. I looked like someone who had been quietly erased. I walked upstairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. The dinner never happened. The toasts were never made. The candles burned for no one. And for the first time in my life, I realized maybe I wasn't part of their idea of family anymore. I didn't cry that night. I thought I might, but the tears didn't come. Instead, I moved through the house in a quiet haze, picking up the napkins no one used, blowing out the candles that had burned too low to save. I wrapped the leftover chicken in foil and put it in the fridge piece by piece, like I was dismantling some illusion I hadn't realized I'd built. The cake, still perfectly frosted, went into the back of the refrigerator. I told myself I'd bring it to the church potluck on Sunday, but we both knew I wouldn't. I cleaned in silence, hands moving on autopilot. I'd done this sort of cleaning before. After family holidays, birthday parties, Thanksgiving dinners. But this time the mess wasn't from people who had been here. It was from the ghost of a gathering that never happened, a celebration that only I had showed up for. The garbage bag crinkled as I dropped the candle stubs inside. Then I paused, looking down at them. 4 elegant tapers, now melted to misshapen lumps. I'd bought them special, a soft ivory color to match the table runner. I tied off the bag tighter than I needed to and left it by the door. Upstairs, I hung the sapphire dress back in the closet. My hand hesitated on the hanger. I didn't know if I'd ever wear it again. It didn't feel like mine anymore. The next morning, I sat in the kitchen with my coffee and stared at the vase of tulips and peonies, now too bright, too cheerful. The flowers didn't know they'd bloomed for nothing. And that's when the memories started creeping in. I'd wanted to believe this was a one-time slip, that Jason and Nina had gotten caught up in some whirlwind and simply forgotten to loop me in. But the truth, this wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the second. I remembered Zach's 5th birthday party. I'd driven across town with a wrapped Lego set and homemade cupcakes with green frosting. His favorite color. When I knocked, Nina answered the door with that pinched smile she always wore when she was pretending to be polite. "Oh, Elaine," she said, surprised. "Didn't Jason tell you? We moved the party to next weekend. There was a scheduling conflict with Zach's soccer team." I stood there, gift in hand, watching other children's shoes already lined up inside the entryway. I could hear laughter coming from the backyard, a bounce house, music, balloons tied to chairs. But I thought the invitation said today, I murmured. She tilted her head. Must have been a mix-up. I'm so sorry you came all this way." She didn't invite me in. I sat in my car for 20 minutes that day, staring at the gift bag in the passenger seat. Then there was Lily's first day of kindergarten. I'd called Nina 3 times the week before to ask what time they'd be dropping her off. I wanted to be there to take a picture to tell Lily how proud I was. "Oh, we're going super early," Nina had said. "Like 6 a.m. Jason's got work, and we didn't want to bother you with such an early morning." But later that day around 9, Nina posted a photo. Lily in a purple dress backpack too big for her small shoulders standing between Jason and Nina outside the school entrance. The caption read, "First day of big girl school." The timestamp, 8:40 a.m. I wasn't too early. I was simply told the wrong time. And then Christmas, last year. I'd offered to host like always, but Nina had called me voice tight with what she called concern. "Elaine, Jason's been so overwhelmed with work. We're thinking something smaller this year. Just the kids and us. Quiet, low-key. I understood. Or I thought I did. I stayed home, heated up a frozen turkey dinner, and watched an old Hallmark movie on the couch with a blanket over my lap. 3 days later, Sandra forwarded me a photo she saw on Nina's Instagram. It was a full holiday spread. Ham, mashed potatoes, wine glasses, 20 people gathered around a long table. Even Jason's college friends were there. I'd been alone again by design. As I sat at my kitchen table, these memories lined up like soldiers, one after the other, refusing to be ignored anymore. A part of me had always made excuses. Maybe Nina was forgetful. Maybe Jason was too stressed. Maybe I was reading too much into things. But when you piece it all together, it stops looking like forgetfulness. It starts looking like strategy. I whispered aloud to no one. What did I do? What did I do to deserve this? Had I said something wrong? Crossed a line I hadn't noticed? Was I overbearing, unhelpful? Had I not been the mother-in-law Nina hoped for? Or was it something else entirely? It wasn't just forgetting to include me. It was the precision of it, the calculated way in which I'd been replaced. They didn't forget the time. They didn't forget to call. They forgot me. Piece by piece, moment by moment, I was being gently, no, deliberately, pushed out of my own family, not with cruelty, but with something worse, dismissal. Like I was fading from view, not important enough to confront, but inconvenient enough to avoid. I looked down at my hands, still holding my now cold coffee, and they shook just slightly. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even sad. I was starting to realize I was being erased. And once you realize that, it's hard to unsee, because the truth was I hadn't disappeared. I'd been pushed. Quietly, gradually, carefully. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I could find my way back in. 3 days after my 65th birthday, I was still trying to make sense of the silence. I'd gone through the motions. Brushing my hair, folding laundry, sweeping the front steps. Like routines might offer some sort of stability. They didn't. The house still felt hollow. The cake still sat in the back of the fridge like a reminder of everything that hadn't happened. That morning, just as I was pouring my second cup of coffee, the doorbell rang. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. I didn't get many visitors these days, and certainly not before 9 a.m. Through the peephole, I saw a man. Maybe in his early 40s, with dark eyes and shoulders that sloped like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. He looked nervous. His hands were shoved deep in his coat pockets. I almost didn't open the door. Something about the set of his jaw made me hesitate. Then he looked up straight at the door and said, clearly, not loudly but firmly enough, "Mrs. Norwood." "Elaine." "Norwood." I opened the door slightly, still keeping the latch in place. "Yes." "Are you Jason's mother?" he asked, his voice cracking. My heart stuttered. "I am... Who are you?" He took a slow breath like he'd been preparing to say this for days. "My name is Derek Lynn. I need to talk to you. It's about Nina." There was something in his voice, pleading but restrained, that made me pause. I studied his face. It didn't feel like a prank or a scam or some stranger's misunderstanding. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, hadn't breathed properly in weeks. I unlocked the door. "Come in," I said softly. He stepped inside cautiously like he was afraid to disturb the air. I offered him coffee, but he declined. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one I'd set just days earlier with name cards no one claimed. His eyes drifted to the fading flowers on the counter. "I don't really know how to start," he said, staring at his hands. "Just tell me what you came to say," I said gently. Derek exhaled slowly. "I was with Nina. Years ago. Before she met your son. Except that's not the name I knew her by. She went by Celeste Martin then. The room seemed to still... We were together for a little over 2 years," he went on. "We lived in Seattle. I was working in IT at the time. She was charismatic, funny, mysterious sometimes. But I loved her. Thought I'd marry her." He rubbed the back of his neck, looking down. Then one day she told me she was pregnant. I was thrilled. Nervous but excited. I started looking at apartments with nurseries, talking about names, but she kept saying she needed time, said it was too soon to make decisions. He paused, and his next words came out like a confession. Then one night I came home from work and she was gone. Everything. Her clothes, her books, even her toothbrush. No note, no call. Just gone. I covered my mouth. My stomach had started to twist. I reported her missing. He continued. I called everyone we knew, hired a private investigator. Nothing. It was like she'd vanished. After 6 months, I gave up. Or tried to. And now I whispered, 3 months ago I saw a photo online. Someone reposted a family picture from a cruise. I wasn't even looking for her anymore, not really. But something caught my eye. It was a boy. A little boy. Same eyes I have. Same way of squinting when he smiles. It stopped me cold. Zach, I murmured, already knowing what he would say next. I couldn't believe it, Derek said. At first I thought I was imagining it. But I found more photos. I started watching from a distance. I know how that sounds, but I didn't know what else to do. I saw him with your son. With her. I started taking pictures, comparing them to old photos of me when I was a kid. He reached into a worn leather messenger bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were several photos. One of a boy, Zach, laughing with a soccer ball. Another of Derek at what looked like age 7, missing a front tooth and holding a fishing rod. The resemblance was staggering. And then he handed me a third photo. Zach smiling with his head tilted slightly to the right, a tiny scar just below his chin. My hands shook. That scar, I said barely above a whisper. Jason told me it happened when Zach was 4. Fell off his bike. They rushed him to the ER. Derek nodded. I have the same scar, same spot. From a swing set accident, age 5. My throat was dry. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to believe Zach was Jason's son, my grandson. But the resemblance, it was undeniable. Derek placed a sealed envelope on the table between us. I didn't want to come here with guesses, he said quietly. So I had a DNA test done. I know the barber they go to. I managed to get a strand of Zach's hair after his last appointment. Had it tested against my own. I stared at the envelope. It might as well have been a stick of dynamite. I got the results yesterday, Derek said. I didn't know whether to come to you or go straight to Jason. But when I saw the way Nina, or Celeste, was cutting you out of everything, I figured you might understand what's really at stake. I looked at him, at this exhausted man who had come to my door not just with a revelation, but with the quiet desperation of someone who had lost a child before he ever got to know him. I didn't touch the envelope. Not yet. Instead, I sat there, hands trembling, knowing that if I opened it, my life, and Jason's, would never be the same. I didn't open the envelope right away. I think I already knew what it would say. But when I finally did with Derek sitting silently across the table, the truth still hit harder than I expected. 99.6% probability of paternity. The words were clinical, printed in neat black ink on stiff paper, but they may as well have been carved into stone. Irrefutable. Cold. Final. I read them twice. 3 times. Hoping somehow the numbers would shift, the ink would rearrange into something else. They didn't. Zach, my sweet, curious grandson who loved dinosaurs and bedtime stories, was not my son's child. He was Derek's. I set the paper down slowly, my hands trembling. Derek didn't speak. He just watched me, and I think he knew. That moment wasn't about him. It was about everything unraveling inside of me. Then he reached into his satchel again and pulled out another file. There's more, he said gently. "You need to see this." I opened it hesitantly. This one was thicker, several pages stapled together with photos clipped to the corners. It was a report from a private investigator. I skimmed the top line. Subject, Celeste Martin. Also known as Nina Norwood. I stopped breathing for a moment. She changed her name about 7 years ago. Derek said, voice low, "Right before she met your son." The documents laid it out in excruciating detail. Celeste Martin, born in Utah. No known family. Raised in the foster system. Married twice. Once in Nevada to a man named Robert Ames, a second time in Oregon to James Delaney. Both marriages lasted less than 18 months. In both cases, she left with a generous alimony settlement and no children. In both cases, she'd moved quickly. From introduction to engagement in under 4 months. Both husbands described her as charming, attentive, almost too good to be true. But after the wedding, things shifted. She slowly discouraged their contact with friends and family. Took over financial matters, managed their calendars, steered them away from anyone who might distract them from the marriage. One even said he'd felt like a puppet by the end, isolated, unsure, grateful for any scraps of affection. And when she'd gotten what she needed, usually money, sometimes property, she vanished. Clean break. No forwarding address. She has a pattern, Derek said quietly. Get close, take control, isolate, extract. Then disappear. I stared at the photos. Celeste on a beach in Oregon in a courtroom in Nevada. Different hair colors, different smiles, but always the same eyes, the same subtle sharpness hiding behind warmth. She's done this before, I said slowly, more to myself than to Derek. And now she's doing it to Jason. He nodded. And to you. My stomach twisted. Images flashed through my mind. Nina, no Celeste, beaming at family dinners, always making the plans, always steering the conversation. She'd insisted on hosting holidays even when I offered. It's easier for the kids, she'd said. Less driving around. I'd believed her. I remembered how Jason used to call me twice a week before they married. We'd talk about everything, from work to what he cooked for dinner. After Nina came into his life, the calls dropped off. Then they became awkward check-ins. And eventually they stopped altogether. He wasn't distant because of stress or time. He'd been pulled away, slowly, strategically. I thought I was losing him to adulthood, I whispered. But I was losing him to her. Derek's silence was agreement enough. She controlled the birthdays, I continued, the holidays. When I could see the kids, she framed it as helpful, protective even. We don't want to overwhelm you, Elaine. You deserve to rest. And I'd believed her. I thought she was kind. Overbearing, maybe, but kind. But she wasn't being kind. She was making me irrelevant, quietly, thoroughly. Jason had become quieter over the years. He used to light up when we talked, laugh easily, confide in me. Now, even when we were in the same room, he looked distracted, like he was waiting for Nina to approve something before he could respond. And she was always there, always hovering, always gently steering the conversation. I thought back to my birthday, to the empty chairs, the untouched plates, the navy blue dress hanging in the closet upstairs. I remembered the Facebook photos, the ones Nina had posted mid-cruise toasting with champagne. Family means everything, the caption read. Yes, family meant everything to her. So long as she was at the center of it. She doesn't just isolate, I said slowly, piecing it together aloud. She replaces. She takes the space that used to belong to others and fills it with herself. Then makes you believe she did it out of kindness. She's very good at it, Derek said. That's what makes her dangerous. I looked at him, and for the first time I saw not just a man looking for his son, but someone who had also been erased. Just like me. We sat in silence for a while. Two people connected by the wreckage of one woman's lies. Then I said it aloud, the words finally forming in my chest with a clarity I hadn't felt in days. This isn't about a missed birthday dinner. Derek looked at me. This is about control. She's not just trying to push me out, she's reshaping my son's world so that I was never part of it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something besides grief. I felt the beginning of a fire. I waited 3 more days before making the call. By then, Derek and I had gone over everything. Twice. 3 times. Not just the facts. Those were already plain and undeniable. But how to share them? How to pull Jason out of the fog without hurting the children? How to bring him back to himself? To me, without destroying him in the process. We can't go through Nina. I'd told Derek and he agreed. She'll twist it. She'll turn him against both of us before he's even had time to read a single page. No, Derek had said quietly. This has to come from you. And I knew he was right. So that Thursday afternoon, I picked up the phone and called my son. It rang longer than usual. When he finally answered, his voice was cautious. Hey, Mom. Hi, sweetheart, I said, keeping my tone warm, steady. I was wondering if we could have dinner this weekend. Just us. The family. I've been doing some thinking. There was a pause. About what? About us. I said simply, about everything. He hesitated, and I could hear the quiet hum of someone else. Nina, no doubt, talking in the background. I'll have to check with Nina. We've been pretty busy since getting back, and... Nothing fancy, I interrupted gently. Just dinner. I'll cook. Saturday night. Another pause. Then, okay. Saturday works. I'm looking forward to it, I said, and meant it. I hung up the phone, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. The next 2 days, I prepared like a woman hosting a summit disguised as supper. I cooked Jason's favorites: rosemary chicken roasted potatoes and the green bean casserole he used to request every Thanksgiving. I bought Zach and Lily new coloring books and set them up in the living room with a cozy rug snacks and their favorite animated movie queued up. I wanted them occupied. Not silenced, not hidden, but protected. The dining room looked warm, familiar, like it always had, before the tension crept in, before I had to rehearse every word to make sure it wouldn't be misconstrued. The place settings were simple but thoughtful, just enough polish to show I cared, but not so much that it felt like a trap. And then at the center of the table, beside the salt and pepper shakers and the folded cloth napkins, I placed a manila envelope. Inside it were 3 things: a copy of the DNA results that confirmed Derek was Zach's biological father, the private investigator's report Celeste's real identity, her past marriages, the timelines, a brief letter I'd written myself, only a few paragraphs, explaining why I had chosen to confront this now and why I wasn't doing it out of vengeance but out of love. The envelope wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It just sat there silent and inevitable. By the time Saturday arrived, the sky had turned gray and soft with early spring mist. The air smelled of damp soil and the faintest hint of rain. It was the kind of weather that always made Jason nostalgic. They arrived just before 6. Nina wore pale pink and too much perfume. She greeted me with that same carefully restrained smile she always used when she wasn't sure what I knew. Jason looked tired but not guarded, just worn. Zach ran to me first. Grandma, I brought my puzzle book. Can we do it later? Of course, sweet boy, I said, hugging him tight. Lily clung to her mother's skirt but smiled shyly when I waved. Nina glanced around the room. You've redecorated. No, I said, smiling. Just cleaned. She didn't sit until Jason did. Dinner began quietly. Small talk. Vacation stories. Nina guiding the conversation the way she always did. Polishing it, managing it, editing anything that didn't serve her narrative. But I noticed the cracks. When Zach started to mention a man who'd waved at them from a car while they were at the park, Nina interrupted with a cough and a question about dessert. When Jason complimented the food, she gently reminded him of his cholesterol. When Lily asked if I could come to her school play, Nina murmured something about too many tickets already being given out. Control always cloaked in kindness, and I just let it pass. For now. After dinner, I asked the kids to take their coloring books into the living room. They happily obliged. Then I turned back to the table, placed my hand on the envelope, and said, "There's something I need to talk to you both about. It won't take long, but it matters." Jason looked up. "Everything okay?" I looked him in the eye. "That depends entirely on how willing you are to listen." I glanced briefly at Nina. To the truth, her smile flickered. Just for a second. The envelope sat quietly between us. I didn't touch it. Not yet. "I'm not here to accuse," I said softly. "And I'm not here to fight. I'm here because I believe Jason deserves to know the truth. Not speculation, not gossip, just truth. Backed by facts, documents, evidence." Jason frowned slightly. "What kind of truth?" "The kind that changes everything," I said, "but also the kind that might just set things right again." And with that, I pushed the envelope toward him. Not forcefully, just far enough so it was within reach. He looked at it confused. Nina stayed silent, but I saw her hands tighten in her lap. It had begun. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the air had changed. And this time I was ready. Ords were allowed. "Smells like home," Jason said as he kissed my cheek, trying to smile. His eyes darted to Nina as if gauging her reaction even before I could respond. "You've been cooking all day again, huh?" "Not all day," I smiled gently. "Just since this morning." Zach burst through the threshold with all the enthusiasm only a 7-year-old could muster. "Grandma Elaine. I learned to float like a jellyfish in the ocean. Wanna see me wiggle?" I laughed and reached down to pull him into a hug. "You can show me after dinner. I missed your jellyfish tricks." He grinned, completely unaware of the truth he carried in his smile. His little arms wrapped around my neck, and for a second I let myself feel only that. Not the pain, not the betrayal, just him. Lily lingered near the door, clinging to Jason's leg. I knelt slowly and held out my arms. "Hi, sweetheart." She looked at Nina before deciding. Nina didn't nod or prompt, but her silence gave permission. Lily stepped toward me shy, but willing, and let me scoop her into a brief, soft hug. She smelled like crayons and applesauce. "You can color after dinner," I whispered. "I've got your favorite markers all set up. Even the sparkly one," she asked. "Even the sparkly one." I led them in, pretending this was any other family dinner. The dining room was warm and glowing. The table was set with my best china, the same place settings I'd prepared for my birthday. The irony didn't escape me. Same plates, different night, but this time we wouldn't be pretending everything was fine. We made small talk as I brought in the food. Pot roast just the way Jason liked it. Garlic mashed potatoes with a little extra cream. Green beans sautéed with almonds and a hint of lemon. The smells of comfort, of memory, of a time when love hadn't yet been filtered through someone else's hands. Nina complimented everything, of course. "It's all so lovely, Elaine. Really, you've outdone yourself." "I wish I had your energy." I smiled politely. She didn't mean it, but she wanted to be seen saying it. Her tone was buttered too smooth to be real. She passed the rolls, dabbed her napkin, redirected conversations with subtle grace. When Jason started to mention a trip we took when he was little, camping in Michigan where he'd nearly caught a turtle, Nina interjected with a story from the cruise. "Oh, Zach got stung by a jellyfish. Or we think it was a jellyfish. But he didn't even cry." Jason stopped, blinked, then laughed on cue. "Yeah, he was brave." The moment passed. Just like always, I watched her more than I ate. She controlled the room without ever raising her voice. She reminded Lily to use her napkin. She cut Zach's roast into bite-sized pieces. She laughed at Jason's jokes, only the ones she approved of. She deflected every emotional opening with something light. Controlled, unthreatening. I recognized the tactic. I'd seen it before. In couples I used to counsel when I volunteered with my church years ago. Quiet domination. The kind you could almost miss if you weren't the one losing your place. After dessert, cinnamon apple pie, which everyone complimented, I cleared the plates. "Why don't the kids play in the living room?" I suggested. "I've set up the puzzle and snacks already." Zach cheered. Lily followed him without protest. Nina moved to stand. "Oh, they should probably head home soon. It's Sunday night." "School tomorrow." "This won't take long," I said, still calm. "But I think it'll affect all our routines quite a bit." Her body didn't move, but I saw the flicker. Just behind her eyes, a shift, the sound of a boundary being scratched. I returned to the table slowly and sat down again. Jason looked at me curiously, concern edging into his face. "What's going on?" "Mom." I took a breath. I'd practiced this, alone in my kitchen for 2 nights straight. How to say what needed to be said without breaking my son in half. "I think it's time we talk openly. Not about dinner, not about vacations, about who we are, and what family really means." I reached beside my coffee cup and pulled forward the manila folder. I didn't push it. I didn't wave it. I just set it in the center of the table. Jason's eyes dropped to the label, "Paternity Test Results." He blinked. "What? What is this?" Before I could speak, Nina's voice slid in like oil. "Elaine, I'm not sure where this is coming from, but it's very inappropriate." Jason turned to her, confusion tightening his face. "What are you talking about?" She stood slowly smoothing her dress. "Your mother's always had a flair for dramatics." I looked directly at Jason. "It's a DNA test, sweetheart. From Zach. It wasn't easy to get, but I had to know. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to understand what he asked, voice small, that he's not your biological son." Jason stared at the folder as if it might bite him. He didn't reach for it. He didn't look away either. Nina's voice was cold now. "This is absurd. You're going to believe a piece of paper over 7 years of raising a child? I'm going to believe what the truth says," I said gently. "And you should too." Jason looked between us, his lips parted slightly. His knuckles were white around his coffee cup. "He's your son in every way that matters," Nina said. "You were there for every diaper, every bedtime story. And I still love him," Jason whispered. "But I also deserve to know the truth." "Why now, Mom?" "Because it took me this long to realize what had been happening," I said. "The birthdays I wasn't told about. The recitals I somehow always missed. The quiet way you stopped calling me first. The room was silent." Jason picked up the folder. His hands trembled. I didn't speak. Nina didn't breathe. He opened it. His eyes scanned the first page. Then the second. The color drained from his face. He looked at me. Then at Nina. "Is this true?" Nina's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Jason looked like a man who had just discovered the floor wasn't real beneath his feet. Outside in the next room, Zach laughed loudly. Lily giggled. Their world hadn't changed yet. But ours had, and I knew from the way Jason looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years, that the fog was starting to lift, that this finally was the moment the truth took its seat at the table. We had served it warm, then cold, but always, always with love. Jason didn't speak for a long time. He just sat there staring at the papers in his hands, his eyes scanning the same sentences over and over like he thought they might somehow change. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. In the living room, the children laughed again. Zach giggling loudly, Lily's softer laughter close behind. The sound pierced the silence like an echo from a happier world, one that now felt irretrievably distant. I watched my son's face carefully. His jaw clenched and unclenched. His breathing was shallow. I knew the signs. I had seen them before. In grieving friends, in parents who'd lost children, in people who had just discovered that their foundation wasn't stone, but sand. Jason, I said softly, Zach isn't biologically yours. His biological father is Derek Lynn. His head jerked up. What? The words hung in the air like smoke, visible thick, impossible to ignore. Derek came to me after seeing your family photos. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but he recognized Zach immediately. There's a paternity test. I had to know before I brought this to you. Jason shook his head slowly, not in denial. More like his body was trying to keep up with a mind unraveling. Nina, Celeste, sat frozen beside him. Her smile was gone. Her eyes darted back and forth, calculating as though trying to find an angle that might still save her. You expect me to believe this? She finally said, her voice thin and sharp. Elaine, you've never liked me. You've always been looking for ways to come between us. This is your big revenge fantasy, isn't it? You went and fabricated DNA results and dug up some man to play along. I didn't flinch. Celeste. That one word hit her like a slap. Her mouth opened, closed, her face lost all pretense. Jason turned to her, confusion deepening into something else. What did she just call you? Nina stood abruptly. She's unstable, Jason. You know how she gets. Your name is Celeste. His voice cracked. He stood too, the folder still in his hand. Is that true? There was no answer. Her silence said everything. I stood slowly, not to threaten, just to steady the room. I reached for the other folder. The one with the documents David's investigator had pulled. I held it out. Jason, I said as gently as I could. This has her real name, her previous marriages, the timelines. It's all here. She didn't just lie to you. She created a life on top of a lie. He didn't take it. He looked like he couldn't hold anything else without falling apart. He just stared at her. Why? His voice was raw. Why would you lie about something like this? I didn't... She tried. But the fight was gone. Her voice had lost its surety. Just tell me, he said again. Was any of it real? The question hung between them. Not just about Zach or even about the name. It was about everything. The dinners. The late-night talks. The way she'd once held his hand in the hospital when Zach had that fever. It was all in question now. But she didn't answer. She couldn't. Jason sank back into his chair. His hands dropped to his lap. He looked smaller somehow. Like a child realizing his whole childhood had been a dream. I don't understand, he whispered. We were happy. At least I thought we were. We had a family. I loved you. Still, no answer. I sat across from him, steady now. What you built, Jason, wasn't fake. Your love was real. Your effort, your sacrifices. Those were real. But you were used. You were taken advantage of by someone who saw your goodness as a tool. He looked at me, then really looked at me. There were tears in his eyes, but also something else, a flicker of relief. As if deep down something had never quite made sense to him, and now it finally did. The inconsistencies, the subtle manipulations, the isolation. It had all been real, and it hadn't been his fault. She told me Zach was early, he said, still dazed. Born premature. I nodded, but he wasn't. The timeline fits perfectly with when she left Derek. His eyes clouded again this time with a mixture of grief and anger. And Lily, she's yours, I said. The timelines line up. Derek never met her. He let out a slow breath, shaky and hollow. I raised Zach. I stayed up all night with him when he was teething. I taught him how to ride a bike. I named him after Dad. I know, I said, and none of that changes. His eyes flicked toward the living room. He's still my son, even if he isn't mine. Yes, I said quietly, and that's why we have to be careful now. For him. For both of them. Nina sat down again quietly this time. She looked pale, her eyes glassy. No more performances. No more spinning. She looked like a woman who knew the game was up but didn't yet understand how completely she'd lost. Jason looked at her, his voice breaking. How could you do this to me? To them? I was scared, she whispered. I didn't know how to tell you. You had years, he said. Years to be honest. Years to let me decide what kind of man and father I wanted to be. You chose control instead. You chose lies. I thought I could make it work, she said. That if I just loved you enough. You didn't love me, he said flatly. You loved what I could give you. A home, a name, a cover. Silence fell again. Jason turned to me. What do I do now? I reached for his hand across the table. You start with what's real. The love you have for your kids. The truth you know now. And you let that be the foundation going forward. He nodded slowly, still dazed. I turned to Nina. Derek isn't going to disappear. And neither am I. If you try to run, if you try to manipulate this situation, I won't, she said. I don't even know what to do. Good, I said. Then don't do anything. Let Jason figure this out. Let Zach and Lily feel safe. That's the only decent thing left for you to do. For the first time, she looked afraid. Not of being caught, but of being truly alone. The web she'd spun had unraveled. The faces in her photo-perfect family now saw her for what she was. Jason stood slowly. I need some air. I'll check on the kids, I said. They don't need to know yet. He nodded, paused, and looked back at me. Thank you, Mom. It was the first time in years I'd heard that tone from him. Genuine, unfiltered, no caution in his voice. Just gratitude. You're not alone, I said. He didn't speak again, but as he stepped onto the porch, I saw him pull his phone from his pocket. And for the first time since the day he stopped calling regularly, I knew who he was dialing first. Not Nina, not his assistant, not even a lawyer. He was calling himself back, and he was doing it with his mother still in his corner. The house felt quieter after she left, not peaceful, just stripped bare like the silence after a storm where you're left looking at what's still standing and what's been washed away. Jason hadn't said a word since Nina, Celeste, walked out the front door. He just sat there at the table, the paternity test still in front of him, his hands folded like he was praying but didn't believe in answers anymore. I didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances. Sometimes what a person needs isn't words. Sometimes it's just presence. I sat with him, the clock ticking softly behind us, the distant murmur of the television from the living room, blending with Lily's quiet humming, and Zach's occasional bursts of laughter. The kids were blissfully unaware of the tectonic shift that had just cracked their family in two. After a long while, Jason finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, like it had scraped against something sharp on the way out. I don't even know who she is. I waited. She's been lying to me from the beginning. About her name, her past, about Zach. And yet, I look at that boy, and I don't feel any different. I still see the baby I rocked to sleep, the toddler who held my finger on his first walk, the kid who calls me Dad without hesitation. His voice cracked, and he blinked hard. I raised him. Mom, I was there for every single moment. I didn't know, but I was there. I nodded, placing my hand gently over his. Then you're his father. Biology doesn't rewrite bedtime stories. It doesn't take away scraped knees or science projects. It doesn't erase love that's already been lived. He swallowed hard. What if he finds out? What if it changes him? It might, I said honestly, but if he's raised by truth and surrounded by love, he'll grow strong. And he'll know he's chosen, not assumed. That kind of love is rare. Jason looked up, tears finally falling. Do you think I was just a placeholder for her? Just someone to raise her child? She probably told herself all sorts of stories to justify what she did. I said, but that doesn't change the fact that you gave Zach a real father. You gave both of them stability, and she can't take that away from you. He shook his head. She almost did. But she didn't. I said, you're still here. And now you get to decide what happens next. The sound of small footsteps came padding down the hall, and Zach peeked around the corner. A cookie in one hand, chocolate smudged across his cheek. Daddy? He asked. Can we watch that movie you promised? Jason stared at him, almost as if seeing him for the first time. The dark eyes that didn't match his. The crooked smile that did. The slight tilt of the head when he was curious, just like Derek's. Zach walked closer and reached for Jason's arm. You okay? Jason scooped him up into his lap, burying his face in his son's hair. I'm good, buddy. I just needed a hug. Zach obliged, wrapping his arms around Jason's neck with the unfiltered affection only a child can give. I love you, Daddy. Jason closed his eyes and held him tighter. I love you too. Always. I turned away for a moment, giving them that quiet space. My heart was heavy but also full. Whatever else happened, this bond was unshakable. Later that night, Derek came by. He had waited at the end of the street just in case Jason wanted to speak to him. When I opened the door, he looked nervous, a paper bag of takeout in hand, like he wasn't sure if food could soften the awkwardness ahead. Is it a bad time? He asked. No, I said gently. It's time. Jason met him at the door. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Jason extended his hand. Derek, right. Yes, he replied, shaking Jason's hand firmly. They stood in the hallway, two men bound by one child, two separate truths that now had to coexist. I don't know what to say, Jason admitted. I'm still processing. You don't owe me anything, Derek said. I just wanted to meet you properly. And to say thank you for being the kind of father Zach needed. Jason nodded, visibly moved. I didn't know, but I don't regret a second of it. You shouldn't, Derek said. You've given him more than I could have. And I'm not here to take anything away from that. I don't want custody, and I'm not here to cause upheaval. I'd like to be part of his life if there's room. Jason took a long breath. There's room, he finally said. As long as we're all clear, Zach is my son. He knows me as Dad. That can't change. I wouldn't dream of taking that from you, Derek said. I'd just like to know him, maybe be a friend to him as he grows up. That's all, and somehow against the odds, something softened between them. Not friendship, not yet, but mutual respect. An understanding forged in the love of the same child. We sat around the kitchen table again, a different table now. One that held space for truth instead of performance. We talked logistics. How to introduce the idea to Zach when the time came, how to move forward in a way that prioritized the children. Lily wandered into the kitchen in her pink pajamas, thumb in mouth, and crawled onto my lap. Did something bad happen? She asked sleepily. No, sweetheart, I whispered, brushing hair from her forehead. Something honest happened. And sometimes that's the best thing. Jason glanced at Derek. You ever read The Velveteen Rabbit? Derek smiled. Long time ago. Why, there's a line in there, Jason said, about how you become real, not by looking perfect or sounding right, but by being loved for a long time. I smiled. That's the line I used to read to you. He nodded. I think Zach's real because he was loved. And maybe that's all that matters. That night, after Derek left and the children were tucked in, Jason and I sat by the fireplace. He looked different, still weary, still hurt, but no longer lost. "Mom," he said, "thank you for not pushing, for being here, for showing me the truth when I didn't even know I needed it." "You're welcome," I said softly. "Love isn't about who we expect. It's about who stays when the world starts shaking." He nodded more to himself than to me. And as the fire crackled low and the shadows settled around us, I realized something that caught me off guard. Sometimes family isn't defined by blood or name, or even shared history. Sometimes family is the hand that doesn't let go when you're slipping. Sometimes it's the truth spoken gently enough to rebuild trust. And sometimes it's just a boy sleeping upstairs, loved by 2 fathers and a grandmother, who would never ever let him be erased again. 6 months had passed since that night. The night Truth sat at my dinner table like an uninvited guest, stripping everything down to what was real and what never truly was. And in the wake of it all, what amazed me most wasn't the devastation left behind. It was what grew in its place. The divorce was finalized 2 months after Nina, or rather Celeste, vanished. No drawn-out courtroom drama, no custody battle, no parting words. She simply disappeared the same way she had walked away from Derek all those years ago. Only this time she left behind something more than just silence. She left behind 2 children, a broken man, and a family learning how to breathe again. Jason didn't talk much about the moment the papers came through. But I saw it in his face that day, the lightness, the disbelief, the quiet mourning for a love that had never really existed the way he thought it had. He cried that night, not over her, but over the time he couldn't get back, the years spent walking on eggshells, the milestones I missed. The tension he hadn't known was unnatural until it was gone. He didn't ask me for advice. He just started showing up more, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit on the porch in silence. The children came with him naturally. There were no more explanations or detours or last-minute changes. They came because this was home again. And slowly, Derek became part of that rhythm too. He rented a small place just 2 blocks over, said he wanted to be close but not disruptive, said he'd follow Jason's lead. But Zach, bless that intuitive little boy, had a way of dissolving boundaries that grown-ups spent too much time guarding. The first time Zach called him Uncle D, Derek nearly dropped his coffee. He looked at me like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to smile. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded slowly. I didn't think I'd ever hear something like that. Now it was routine. Zach would bounce through the door on Sundays yelling, "Uncle D, did you bring the cinnamon rolls?" And Derek, always prepared, would pull a box from the passenger seat of his car with a mock sigh of exasperation. It became our thing. Sunday dinner, not a grand declaration, just something that emerged from the need to be together. I didn't even realize it was a tradition until Zach asked Grandma, "What are we having next Sunday?" And Lily added, "I'm making you another card." Okay. The first time we all sat around the table again. Me, Jason, Zach, Lily, and Derek. I was terrified that it would feel forced, that the chairs left empty by the past would haunt us, but they didn't. In their place was something better. Lily sat next to me now, her little fingers covered in marker smudges as she handed me a folded piece of paper with uneven hearts and stick figures. "That's you," she explained, pointing to a lopsided drawing of a woman with gray hair and a crown. "Because you're the queen of the house." Zach had brought dessert. A peach cobbler he insisted he helped bake, though Jason mouthed to me from across the kitchen that it was store-bought. Derek brought wine, and Jason brought himself in a way he hadn't been able to for years. I cooked my pot roast just like I used to. The same recipe Jason used to request on his birthday, only now it wasn't to impress or to heal or to win anyone back. It was simply because I wanted to feed the people I loved. As we ate, the conversation drifted from school projects to Derek's clumsy attempt at assembling IKEA furniture. Jason laughed so hard at one point he nearly spit out his wine. Lily kept correcting everyone's manners with exaggerated flair, and Zach was busy sneaking extra rolls when he thought no one was looking. But I was looking. I was watching all of it. Each laugh, each small moment, and tucking it away like tiny treasures. Because I knew what it was like to be erased. And this was the proof that I wasn't. At one point, Jason leaned back in his chair and looked around the table. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think family was what you were given. Bloodlines, birthdays, traditions." He looked at me. "But I think it's really about who stays, who shows up." I didn't say anything, just reached for his hand. He squeezed mine back. Derek, sitting at the other end of the table, nodded slowly. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. "I mean, not just a connection to Zach, but this. Space to belong." "You earned it," Jason said. "You didn't force your way in. You waited. You respected what was already here. That matters." The rest of the evening was a blur of board games, spilled juice, and warm dishes piled in the sink. When Derek offered to do the washing up, Jason waved him off and told him to go help Zach look for his lost Lego under the couch. And in the quiet moment that followed, I found myself staring at the empty chair that once belonged to Nina. Celeste. Whatever name she had worn last. For a long time I hated that chair. I hated what it represented. The power she'd had, the control she'd wielded, the way she'd tried to rewrite all of us into roles that served her script. But now it was just a chair, a place someone used to sit, and it no longer held any weight. Because what she tried to build was a performance, a story held together by secrecy and control. What we built in her absence was real. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't symmetrical. It didn't look like the polished families you see on holiday cards, but it was honest. It was chosen. And it was ours. Later that night, as I folded Lily's drawing and set it on my mantel next to the framed photo of Jason as a toddler, I whispered to myself, "She tried to erase me. But what she left behind is something she never had. Real love." And that made all the difference. Because I wasn't just back in my family, I was home. Sometimes I still find myself standing in the kitchen with the light just right, and I'll see the flicker of something in the corner of my memory. The candles that melted down to nothing. The cake I wrapped in silence, the table set for a celebration that never came. That night, I thought I had reached the end of something. Of being needed. Of being seen. Of being part of a family. But now, on Sunday afternoons, when the house hums with laughter and footsteps and the clatter of silverware, I realize it wasn't the end at all. It was the clearing of a path. This past Sunday, I stood over the stove finishing up the mashed potatoes when Zach burst into the kitchen, wearing a homemade crown made of construction paper and pipe cleaners. "Grandma." "Grandma, we made you a surprise." I turned around and barely got a breath in before he started singing at the top of his lungs. "Happy birthday to you." "Ooh." Lily joined in, next slightly off-key, but fully committed. Jason and Derek followed, trying to keep up, while I just stood there holding a wooden spoon like it was the only thing anchoring me to the moment. They'd planned an early birthday for me 3 days before the date. Jason said they didn't want to risk missing the real one, and Lily had taken it upon herself to be the party planner. There were balloons, crookedly taped to the doorway, cards with backwards letters, and a chocolate cake from the bakery down the street with Queen Elaine scrawled across the top in thick blue icing. Zach handed me a card he'd made himself. On the front, he'd drawn a picture of all of us standing in front of my house. I was in the middle holding hands with both him and Lily. Derek was beside Zach. Jason stood on the other side of Lily. The sky was yellow. He'd run out of blue. "I drew the sun like it's always shining when we're here," he said, grinning. And it was. In some strange poetic way, it always felt like the sun knew when our family was whole. Later, after the children went outside to play, Jason stayed behind and helped clear the dishes. We worked in quiet coordination, me drying him stacking plates. Then he set the towel down and leaned against the counter. "Mom," he said softly, "I need to say something." I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw the little boy he used to be. The one who scraped his knees and brought me wildflowers. The one who used to whisper, "Don't tell Dad, but you're my favorite." "I should have seen it," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I should have seen what was happening to you, how she treated you, how she shut you out. I didn't want to believe that the life I built was based on a lie." I reached over and put my hand on his. "You weren't the one who needed to protect me, honey. You were the one who needed protecting. You were doing your best. You were loving the way I raised you to love, fully blindly with your whole heart. And she took advantage of that." His shoulders relaxed. For the first time in a long time, he looked like a man who could breathe again. We sat on the couch after that, both of us too tired to say much. Lily came in later with a daisy she picked from the garden and tucked it behind my ear. "Now you look like the queen for real," she said before skipping off again. After they left and the house quieted down, I made myself a cup of tea and pulled out my journal. The one I started right after my 65th birthday. The one I nearly threw away when I wrote the words, "I don't know who I am to them anymore." But I hadn't thrown it away. I kept writing. I wrote through the pain, the discovery, the truth, and the rebuilding. And now, with the last golden threads of sunlight streaking across my living room, I wrote this. At 65, they thought they left me behind. But I found something more precious. The family we chose. Not the one shaped by obligation or fear or manipulation, but one born from truth, forgiveness, and choice. Zach didn't need my DNA to call me Grandma. Derek didn't need a marriage certificate to belong at our table. And Jason? Jason didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to come home. I closed the journal, pressing my hand to the cover. Then I whispered the last line out loud, the way someone might say grace before a meal. The truth I served was cold, somehow, but it gave us back the warmth we'd been missing. And for the first time, I didn't dread growing older, because I knew exactly where I belonged. And I knew who would be there next Sunday asking for more mashed potatoes, singing too loud, forgetting to use coasters, and filling every corner of this home with the kind of love that no deception could ever manufacture. This was the family we became. Not despite the truth, but because of it. If this story touched something in your heart, if you've ever felt forgotten, pushed aside, or slowly erased by the very people you love, just know you're not alone. Maybe you've lived through a birthday like Elaine's, or maybe you've quietly waited for a phone call that never came. What would you have done in her shoes? Would you have stayed silent? Or, like Elaine, found the courage to stand in your truth with quiet strength? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments, because your voice matters here. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of sacrifice, awakening, and quiet power, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way you'll never miss the next chapter in a journey that might just reflect your own. Thank you for watching and for being part of this community.